The Washington Commanders went out and made some hires. They've got a new head coach. They have cut ties with their offensive coordinator and brought in a new one. And there's a good bit to unpack here as Dan Quinn is now the Washington Commanders' new head coach. And I don't think this was the right hire because just like the Seahawks were defensively driven for the better part of the better part of the last 14 years, so have the Commanders with the very, small amount of identity that they do have. Don't you eventually want to be offensive? And I understand Dan Quinn coming over from the Cowboys built a very great Cowboys defense over there. I'm not going to really give him a whole lot of the credit with the time he was with Atlanta, but we'll get into that in just a second. The defense was worse than the NFL last year. It was 32nd in yards and 32nd in points. So you can't get much worse than that. They've got some talent on both sides of the ball. Unfortunately, we did see them unload their defensive line at the trade deadline with a Chase Young, with a Montez Sweat, who both guys, I think equally are going to get some nice paydays. We know Montez Sweat was extended with the Bears, and it was an upgrade over Ron Rivera, no doubt. But don't you eventually want to be offensive in a league where, again, all of the elite teams in the NFL are offensive minded? And we can't call the Texans elite just yet. I don't think the Texans are an elite team just yet. And they do have a defensive minded guy at head coach, and D'Amico Ryans, a former player as well. But I don't like the Dan Quinn hire to the Washington Commanders. And again, you got to have baby steps. Maybe it's too much to ask them to flip it around and become offensively driven with a guy like Sam Howell who threw, 21 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. But I just wonder why another defensive minded head coach hire who is unproven. He's 43 and 42 as a head coach. Kyle Shanahan, yes, I'm going to say it. Kyle Shanahan made those two Falcons teams as prolific as they were in 2016 and 2017, which we saw Kyle Shanahan give them the first best team in points, and the second best team in yards as well. But they didn't thrive under Dan Quinn's leadership once Kyle Shanahan went to be the offensive coordinator or head coach for the Niners. Dan Quinn went 14 and 23 once Kyle Shanahan left, and that was with a Steve Sarkisian, that was with a Dirk Cutter who was calling plays, and that includes the 0 and 5 goose egg before he got fired in 2020. And I understand he has played a major part in that Cowboys defense. We also saw that Cowboys defense give up 48 points in the last game that Dan Quinn was a defensive coordinator, but that's neither here nor there. The Cowboys defense is what it is now, and we know Jack Del Rio did what he could over the last few years, gave the Commanders a top 8, top 10 defense in terms of points and yards, I believe in 2022 and in 2020. But Washington hasn't had a top 10, top 15 offense, top 15. I'll even give them a little bit of slack. They haven't even been a middle of the pack offense in 7 years. Since 2017, they haven't had a top 10 offense in almost 10 years. It's 2024. Offense wins championships, not defense. Just like on Sunday, both great defenses are coming into the game. But what's going to decide who wins that game? Points and which offense can overcome the defense and be victorious. And again, baby steps. It might be asking a team a lot to turn their identity from what's been defensively minded for the last few years into offensively minded. They still have a heavy lift at the quarterback position. The roster overall can be a mostly heavy lift. Again, they do have some talent on that team. I like Terry McLaurin. I like Brian Robinson. I like Antonio Gibson, De'Ami Brown. We know some Jahan Dotson. We know some of the players that the Commanders present, but they're going to need to get better on that defensive side of the ball. I don't see Dan Quinn really winning more than 7 games with this franchise. Now, they only won 4 last year, and they've got that number 2 overall pick, which we're going to talk about on episode 65 on Friday. Could they actually be pushing into the Caleb Williams sweepstakes? I think they are, but I don't see this team winning any more than 7 games this year. I don't. Dan Quinn is 43 and 42 as a head coach. Yes, he went to a Super Bowl. Yes, his defense blew a 25-point lead. His offense was only prolific under Kyle Shanahan. Don't tell me he didn't have a good OC. Don't tell me that Steve Sarkisian, who is tearing it up with Texas right now, don't tell me that Dirk Cutter didn't have that offense where it needed to be, because I will say in that same breath, even with the defensive-minded guy in Dan Quinn, his offensive coordinators carried him to a better offense than what Arthur Smith had with the same offensive coordinator in the seasons that he was with the Atlanta Falcons. But I think Dan Quinn's going to bring some good leadership to this team. I think he's going to bring a bigger defensive prowess and experience as well. Again, you can't get much worse than literally the worst in the NFL in terms of points and yards. And we're going to get a more updated football mind over Ron Rivera as well. We're not going to um what's it called? We're not going to get a 7-9, 8-8 average or standard, I feel like, that Ron Rivera established over the last few years. Because we did see when things were right that Dan Quinn was able to make the Falcons a good team. But I'm still going to give most of that credit to the offensive coordinator because, again, he was 14-23 once Kyle Shanahan left, including an 0-5 stint that got him fired in 2020. But he's going to be a leader. He's going to couple years before I still be in contention. But again, it's baby steps, and you got to do what you got to do.